Escape to Freedom by Ruth Fosdick Jones. Chapter 5. Not even your own mother would know you. We shall have to take extra care with this one. John Blaine pushed the newspaper across the kitchen table for his wife and Timothy to see, his finger pointing to an advertisement headed by the tiny running figure of a woman with a tied bundle clutched in one hand. $500 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on Saturday, August 20th, black slave woman. Carrie Jameson, who is about 20 years of age, about 5 foot 6 inches high, slender, of a dark mahogany color with straight nose and prominent cheekbones, might be taken for an Indian except for her color. She is soft-spoken, intelligent, and an excellent parlor maid and waitress. The above reward will be given to any person who will apprehend the said Carrie Jameson, thought to have reached Buffalo, and send her safely to Bucktown, Dorchester County, Maryland. August 29th, 1853. W.R. Butler. I knew the chase was on, but I didn't think they would advertise for her so soon, said John Blaine. Now, he added ruefully, everybody from the marshal and all his deputies on down to the lowest of the agents and informers will be keeping an eye peeled for her. It's a nice, clear description, too. She looks exactly like a mahogany-colored Indian. She's out in the shed, Father? Asked Timothy. Yes, son, since last night, answered his father. And how am I going to get her out of there safely? He rose from his chair and began to pace up and down the room. Mary Blaine read the advertisement again. Since she looks so much like an Indian, can't you dress her like one and get her across the river that way? There are always quite a few of them around this time of year selling the baskets they have made during the winter. Timothy smiled at his mother. As usual, she had solved everything. But his father shook his head. No, Mary, that's too obvious. Then, seeing that they were disappointed to have the suggestion turned down, he went on. Look at it this way. If you were on the watch for a fugitive slave who was described as looking like an Indian, wouldn't you naturally take a sharper look than usual at every Indian woman who came in sight? If I took her out of here dressed like that, she'd be caught before we got to Niagara Street. No, we'll either have to keep her hidden until the hue and cry dies down or put a bold face on it and get her across the river as soon as we can, right under the marshal's nose. He took another turn down the room and back. But how? I can't take her out from under cover with that description of her. He stopped speaking and stood in deep thought, his hands gripping the back of his chair. That's it, he said suddenly. It's the only way. Mary? Yes, John? Isn't there something you need from the dry goods store? It is already September, and surely you must be thinking of the clothes we shall need for this winter. Why, yes, answered Mary Blaine composedly. I might just see if Meldrum's has any good woolen cloth that would make Tim a jacket. And Dora needs a new dress for Sundays. I can see that Carl waits on me, she added, smiling, and I will give him a message. Timothy could restrain his curiosity no longer. Is this Carl Bintz you are talking about, old Mrs. Bintz's son? Yes, son, said his father. You never thought, did you, that Mrs. Bintz might have a reason for keeping folks, especially sharp-eyed boys, out of her yard? He chuckled at Timothy's open-mouthed astonishment. You see, he explained, Carl is invaluable to us. Carl is? Asked Timothy incredulously. His father nodded. Carl is a man who leads 2 lives. In one life, he is a mild-mannered clerk in a dry goods store. In the other, he is one of the boldest conductors on the Underground Railroad. He is so daring, in fact, that some of the rest of us are cautious about working with him because he operates so openly that we are afraid he may be caught. But right now, we have need of boldness and also of Carl's particular talents. We'll never get Carrie Jameson across the river safely unless we disguise her. And Carl can do that to perfection. He used to be a dresser in German theater before he came to this country. He painted and disguised people for their appearance on the stage. John Blaine turned to his wife. It was your proposal to dress Carrie as an Indian woman that led me to think of using Carl, he said. Now you see that your idea was useful after all. So, Mary, will you please ask Carl if he can come to see me tonight, and we'll put the problem of Carrie Jameson up to him. The day dragged for Timothy. Jake had gone to Rochester with his family, and there was not very much that Timothy could do, with his arm still in a sling. Besides, he was delegated to stay with Dora, while his mother went downtown to Mr. Meldrum's store to give Carl Bintz his father's message. After an hour of building towers of Dora's blocks on the back steps, towers which she promptly knocked over with great glee, and then said, "Timmy, make another one for Dora," he had had enough. "No, Dora," he said finally, "let's play horsey now. You get in your cart, and I'll be your horse and pull you." Dora agreeably scrambled into the cart, and Timothy, with his one good arm, pulled her around and around the yard. When he passed beneath the first settler, he thought how wonderful it would be to scramble up there and read, or even just to sit high up among the branches. And when he bumped Dora past the door of the shed, he wished he could go in and talk to Carrie Jameson, hiding there in the loft. He even wished, when he passed the chopping block, that he had two good arms, so that he could split some kindling. Anything was better than nursemaiding a 3-year-old. After a dozen trips around the circuit, he gave up. "Come on, Dora," he coaxed. "Your horsey's tired. Let's sit here on the steps, and I'll tell you a story." But Dora rebelled. "No," she said flatly. "Dora not tired." She settled her chubby figure more firmly in the cart. "Oh, come on," urged Timothy, as patiently as he could. "No," said Dora again, and stuck out her lower lip. "Oh, well, then let's make sand pies," suggested Timothy desperately. Dora's round pink face lit up. "With water?" she asked firmly. Timothy sighed. He knew that he had been outmaneuvered. "With water," he agreed. He sat down on the steps to watch the gradual mixture of Dora with sand and water, from her tight brown curls to her black buttoned shoes. His mother found them there when she came home with her purchases: a length of blue serge for his jacket, some turkey red flannel for Dora's dress, and enough soft green material with a tiny brown sprig in it to make a dress for herself. "I am afraid you will have to shingle someone's barn to make up for what I have spent today, John," she said a little ruefully to her husband when he came home. "But you can't stop at Carrie Jameson's face when you disguise her. I know that when she leaves this house, one of my dresses will leave with her, to say nothing of a shawl and probably a bonnet. Your work is very hard on my wardrobe." John Blaine chuckled. "And there is nothing you like better than an excuse to have a new dress." His wife laughed. "How well you know me, John. But seriously, I shall soon be scrubbing the floors in my best brown silk because I have had to give everything else away. People will say, 'My, but Mrs. Blaine puts on airs.' You would think her husband was President of the United States, which of course he very well should be," she added gaily, and kissed her husband's cheek as she went past him on her way to the pantry. Mr. Blaine smiled indulgently. "I think your shopping expedition has gone to your head, Mary," he said. Their supper was a cheerful meal, and Timothy and his mother were singing over the dishes when Carl Bintz slid into the kitchen after a rapid knock at the back door. He was a little gnome of a man, swarthy and bald, with a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles that sat astride his big nose and gave to his round face an owlish look that was completely misleading. There was nothing slow or sleepy about Carl Binz. His mind worked with the rapidity and precision of a steel trap. "Well, well, Mr. Blaine," he said to Timothy's father, nodding to Mrs. Blaine and Timothy as he closed the door. "What trouble is it now dot you want I should get in?" For answer, Timothy's father put the advertisement from the newspaper before Carl. He read it laboriously, his lips moving as his forefinger followed the lines of the small type. "Und you have dis one here?" he asked when he had finished. John Blaine nodded. "But I can't move her unless she is disguised. She would show up like a candle in a dark room." "So," Carl clicked his tongue sympathetically, then slapped his thigh. "Well, I can think of nothing to do until I see this woman." "Go and fetch her in, will you please, Tim?" asked his father. This time Timothy was careful on the ladder, and he was careful too, although it was dusk, to skirt the yard, keeping in the shadow of the first settler and the high board fence. Beyond telling her that his father wanted her to come to the house, Timothy held no conversation with Carrie Jamieson. Nor did she utter a word on their way across the yard together. But once inside the door, the woman turned to him and said in a low, sweet voice, "Thank you, Master Timothy. You see, I know your name, and hear you talking when you was a-taking care of your little sister this afternoon. There I was, a-wishing I could be playing with her and telling her stories, and there you was, a-wishing to be doing something else." She smiled, showing even white teeth in an attractive dark face. Then she turned to Timothy's parents, and Carl Binz, who Timothy saw was regarding her intently from behind the glasses. When the introductions were over, Mr. Blaine again picked up the paper with its notice of the reward offered for the capture of Carrie Jamieson and handed it to her. "Can you read?" he asked. The girl raised her eyes from the page. "I don't need to read to tell you what that means, Mr. Blaine," she said. "I seen plenty hornbills with that same little picture on 'em nailed to the trees around the plantation. It's offering a reward for taking me, ain't it?" There was fear in the girl's eyes. "Yes," answered Timothy's father, "but nobody is going to collect that reward, Carrie, because we're going to get you to Canada in spite of them. That is why Mr. Binz is here. He is going to change your appearance so that not even your own mother would know you." Carl was rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I thought, Mr. Blaine, that I would dress this woman like a man, but," he shook his head in exasperation, "she come through from de South too fast." John Blaine frowned. "What do you mean, Carl, that she came through from the South too fast?" "Look at her," cried Carl. "A month, maybe a day, baby. She lose some weight. She ain't now fat, but," he complained, "she ain't a man shape." He gestured eloquently. He stared at Carrie disapprovingly, then nodded vigorously. "She will have to stay a woman. I paint her white." "And I'll contribute a dress and a bonnet," murmured Mary Blaine from the background. "Yea," agreed Carl approvingly. "We shall need dot and a veil too." "A veil?" asked Mrs. Blaine, surprised. "Yeah, I turned this woman white, but if somebody sit beside her on the ferry boat, he will see she is paint." Carl was fast losing control of his English, which was an accurate barometer of his absorbing interest in Carrie Jamieson. Mr. Blaine motioned them all to sit down. "All right, Carl, that is settled then. You will paint Carrie white, but once we have her disguised, have you any idea of how we can get her across the river? I'm afraid that the ferry is too much of a risk this time." "Nein, nein," Carl disagreed empathetically. "Sure, somebody watched that boat, but not looking for a white woman especially." He held up a stubby finger to emphasize his words. "Especially if she is my sister, who is come from Bavaria, and stopped to see me and the old woman before she goes on to stay by my other sister in Canada, and find her another husband," he added as a final inspiration. "She is a widow, of course. I myself will take her across on the ferry boat and set her on her way." He spoke to Carrie. "Is any place special you want to go?" he asked happily. "My husband is waiting for me in a place called St. Catherine's," Carrie replied. "Is that far from here?" Not far," John Blaine broke in. Just across the river and down the Canadian side toward Lake Ontario." He turned to Carl. "There's only one objection that I can see to your plan. It doesn't go far enough. The plan to get your sister from your house across the river should work, but how will you get her from here to your house? I think she really will have to stay with you for 2 or 3 days, or your neighbors should see you bring her home, which means that you will have to meet her." "Meet her where?" asked Carl. "That is what I am trying to figure out," answered John Blaine. Timothy had been following their conversation closely. "Father," he interrupted, "didn't you tell me once that no trains ever ran south on the Underground Railroad?" "Why, yes, Tim, I did," said his father, surprised. "Well, then," said Timothy, "why can't you take Carrie in our wagon back along the line a ways, put her on the train, and let Carl meet her at the depot in Buffalo? If the marshal and his men think that she has already arrived here, they won't be looking for her at the depot. They'll be watching the river. It really will look as though Mr. Bince's sister has come from Bavaria to visit him." He broke off. His father was staring at him. "Out of the mouth of babes," he murmured. "It's as near to a foolproof scheme as we can get, Carl. Thank you, son." Timothy flushed with pleasure. His father leaned back in his chair. "Now this is what we shall do. You will come here tomorrow night, Carl, and transform Carrie. Early the next morning, I shall take her in the wagon to Attica. There is a man there who has some seasoned boards that I have been dickering for, and I shall bring them back with me. That will give me an excuse for the journey. I shall see that Carrie gets on the train at Attica, and you will meet her at the depot here in Buffalo, and take her to your house. You might let it be known that your sister is coming to visit you. I see no harm in that. Since your mother thinks your work with the Underground Railroad is more important than being on friendly terms with the neighbors, they probably will not come to call." Carl Bince and John Blaine smiled understandably at each other. Timothy felt considerably abashed when he remembered the vindictive thoughts he had had about Mrs. Bince and her gander. Never, he vowed, would he tease the bird again. "Now," his father continued, "Carrie will stay with you. Oh, I should think for 2 days, and on the 3rd day you will take her across to Canada. That should work out perfectly," he added. "The 3rd day will be Sunday, and the ferry should be crowded, so that you will have less chance of being noticed." "I think that is a very good plan," said Mary Blaine, looking up from the sock she was knitting. "It will give me tomorrow to fix over a dress to fit Carrie. We shall need that much time, for she is bigger than I am." I'll help you, Mrs. Blaine," volunteered Carrie. "I was taught to sew on the plantation, so that I could mend the linen." Carl rose from his chair. "I go home now," he announced, "und think what will change this woman from black to white. I got to make something dot won't be so stiff she can't move her face." He bade them all good night and slipped out as quietly as he'd come, through the yard and over the fence. Timothy suspected, as he heard not the faintest sound, that might be the yard gate closing. John Blaine shot the bolt on the door and sat down at the table again. "How do you happen to know that your husband is waiting for you in St. Catherine's?" he asked Carrie. "Because Moses told me last spring," she answered readily. "Moses?" asked Mr. Blaine, puzzled. Carrie smiled. "My people call her that, because the first we know she's around. We hear her singing always the same song, Go Down Moses. You see, she run away to the north 4 or 5 years ago, far as Philadelphia. But then she came back and take a party of slaves north with her. Now, every year in the spring and fall she comes, and 'cause she say we ain't safe here in the north no longer, she takes us all the way to Canada, to St. Catherine's. And the one she can't take herself, she tells how to get there. Last fall she took my man, 'cause they was going to sell him south. I was sick with the fever then and couldn't go. And after he run away, they watched me so close I didn't dast to go when Moses come this spring. But she told me where to get on the railroad and to pretend to forget my man. So I let the coachman make up to me. Then they reckoned I didn't want to run away no more and didn't watch me and just left in the night. I never heard the like, exclaimed John Blaine wonderingly. This fugitive slave who might be caught at any moment keeps going back to Maryland all the way from Canada. He turned to Timothy. I was wrong, son. Trains do run south on the Underground Railroad. Tell me, he said to Carrie, this Moses, do you know her real name? Carrie nodded. Her name is Harriet Tubman, she answered proudly, as though she were introducing a cherished friend. So Timothy and his parents first heard of the remarkable woman who in those years before the Civil War led more than 300 slaves to freedom.